There's no reserving of seats, so obviously this morning no problem, but please, just throughout the day and throughout the festival, it's a full democracy here. There's no saving of seats, it's first come, first served. No flash photography, so you're welcome to take photographs, but just no flashes. And please, please, everybody turn their phones to silent. If you do need to have a very urgent conversation during the session, if you could just take it out the back there and just keep quiet, that would be very kind. If you could also just help us keep the aisles clean, and just, if you wouldn't mind just taking your rubbish with you and just popping it in the bins that are around, that would be fabulous. And there's going to be, well, there is an information desk. If you have any questions or problems, anyone in green will do our best to help you, but there's also an information desk just behind us there where the yellow arch is, and the washrooms are just behind here. So, finally, if you're a Twitterer, if you'd like to tweet about the festival, hashtag Jaipur Litfest, we'd love to get the buzz going. Now, before I introduce our authors, I just have to say a quick thank you, and I'll do my best to be as quick as possible, to our wonderful sponsors, who we would not be here without. So I just need to do a very quick list, if you'll be patient with me. Just many thanks to DSC, Tata Steel, Google, Airtel, Coca-Cola, Rajasthan Tourism, Councilage, Public Diplomacy, ICCR, Incredible India, the wonderful alcohol sponsors Glenlivet, Nine Hills and Kingfisher, Vodafone, Rajasthan Patrika, The Hindu, DNA, Dainik Bhaskar, Hindustan Times, the Directorate of Film Festivals, the Foundation of Jan Michalski, the Harvard University Press, American Center, Penguin, British Council, and also all our hotels. Thank you to the ITC, Oberoi, Taj, Samode, of course to Diggy, and for all of you that was at the music last night, you may know that our music stage is no longer at the Diggy Palace. It's actually been moved to Hotel Clark's Amer, and it was amazing last night. So that's every night between 7 and 10. Everybody's welcome. Hotel Clark's Amer is the location. Westland, Canada Council for the Arts, the Australia-India Council, the Italian Cultural Centre, Instituto Cervantes, Institut Francais, Yatra Books, the State of Bikaner in Jaipur, the State Bank of Bikaner in Jaipur, Avid Learning, Ambuja Neotia Group, the Edinburgh Writers the World Writers' Conference and the International Book Festival in Edinburgh, the National Book Trust, Rajasthan Royals, Royal Gems, McCann Workshop, Britannia, Prabha Kaitan Foundation, and finally DLF. Thank you for your patience. So, without further ado, I would like to invite the author and our moderator to the stage for this session, Far From the Tree, Parents, Children and the Search for Identity. I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful session. Please give a very warm welcome to our author, Andrew Solomon, and our moderator, Madhu Trehan. Thank you so much.
So we face each other. Welcome, Andrew. Andrew Solomon, in his book, Far From the Tree, has taken a giant step, in my mind, in so far going into, I think, untrodden territory. He had 400,000 pages of interviews with over 300 families, and he examines, analyzes, and puts his own concepts forward. He is a true original thinker. He looks at families who have children very different from the parents, how the parents react, cope, and care for such children. While reading the book, you will find yourself dealing with prejudice, and the book demands a new way to look at the other. Conceptual thinking, new conceptual thinking, which pushes you into new perspectives. Andrew, at the end of his book, in the last chapter, says that he wrote the book to forgive his parents. Andrew, I'd like you to start with that. What did you have to forgive, and what motivated you more than just wanting to forgive your parents? Obviously, there's a big huge baggage there. Would you like to explain that?
So one of the founding ideas of the book is that families respond to children who are dramatically different from them in a variety of ways. And my basis for having any expertise in this area was that I'm gay and my parents are straight. And I was very interested in the idea that there are many identities that occur in people who have some difference from their parents. Deaf children are mostly born to hearing parents, dwarfs are mostly born to parents of average height, autistic children mostly have non-autistic parents, and I was interested in that paradigm. But when I said that I set out to forgive my parents, I feel as though in the initial period with my parents of my explaining to them who I was and explaining that I myself was gay, I feel like there was a lack of acceptance. At the time, I thought that lack of acceptance constituted a lack of love. But over time, as I continued to experience all of these people and all of these conditions, I discovered that almost nobody can accept their child unconditionally and right from the start. And that almost always it takes a little bit of time for the acceptance to set in, and that the lack of acceptance is not a lack of love. And I think I set out to investigate how all of these different families responded to all of these different conditions in order to understand what the commonalities were and to know authentically what it was that my parents had had to go through in recognizing me for who I am and for coming to love and accept me fully.
What was your parents' reaction to your book?
Well, my mother sadly died many years ago, and my poor father is now used to the fact that I write books in which he makes an appearance. But he was incredibly enthusiastic and supportive. He read every draft of the book. He was sort of all behind it. And he said to me, though we had long ago said it, he said, "I'm sorry if it took me a little while and if that was difficult for you." And I said, "But I've now understood there's not much for you to apologize for." And so I think it was actually quite a joyful thing between the two of us.
And you did write that your father is accepting by nature.
Yes, I think my father tends to be accepting, and I think it was harder for my mother. But as I said in the book, I think my father accepts himself readily, and I think my mother didn't always accept herself so readily. So that tension was par for the course. My mother died just a few years after I came out, but when she died, she said very strongly and clearly that her primary hope for me was that I would find someone to love who would love me also. She said, "That's all I ever really wanted for you. It's all I ever will really want for you."
You say that, and this I think is a revolutionary thought, you say many conditions are both illness and identity, but we can see one only when we obscure the other. Identity politics refutes the idea of illness, while medicine shortchanges identity. It's a very complex concept. Both are diminished by this narrowness. You're asking the world to look at ourselves and the other differently. This is a huge demand. Difficult to communicate, which you have done in this book, but difficult to communicate, say, in a conversation, and be effective. And it's difficult for it to actually happen, don't you think?
It's very difficult for it actually to happen. But I'm very struck that when I was born in the United States, it was a crime and an illness to be gay, that everyone subscribed to a medical model and to a punitive criminal model. And now the President of the United States, Barack Obama, has come out in favor of gay marriage. And in my own life, as I live it with a husband and a beloved child, there's no question that gayness is, for us at least, an identity. And I thought, how did that happen? How could so much change take place in the 49 years that I've been alive? And as I began to investigate that, I thought, where else can it happen? I got very interested in the deaf politics movement in the United States, in which people who are deaf say that they belong to a linguistic subgroup that uses sign language and that they are not, in fact, suffering from an illness at all. And many of them have said they don't wish to acquire hearing. So if we look at those ironies of a culture in which there is this constant transformation going on, I said, what else can you look at it as an illness? And what else can you look at as an identity? And what I finally concluded was that there is a kind of illness model of everything. You could say that it's an illness to be American or Indian or Jewish or Hindu or anything. You can say it creates some difficulties and you can look at it from that point of view. Or you can say it's a cherished and amazing thing which is full of meaning, and you can do that even with conditions like being someone who commits crimes or being someone who's severely disabled. Even those areas allow for the identity model. And I wanted to look at what it means when we parse things and we say, well, this is actually an identity and this is actually an illness. Frequently it's a divide which is fairly random and which changes over time.
In fact, in your chapter on the deaf, you go to Bali and find a community who celebrate it. And in conjunction to what you said about the deaf, some of them who made the choice, took the decision of not wanting to get cochlear implants because they wanted to remain deaf. And some of them deliberately married deaf women or men, and were hoping to have deaf children because they saw it as a community, as you say. In fact, a rather well-known person in India got his hearing fixed, he was deaf, in Australia, and it was so painful to him to hear for the first time in his life, he reversed it.
Right.
He could not handle hearing all the noises which for decades he had not heard.
Right.
I'd like to read from a paragraph from your book, right here.
Broadcasting these parents' learned happiness is vital to sustaining identities that are now vulnerable to eradication. Their stories point a way for all of us to expand our definition of the human family. It's important to know how autistic people feel about autism, or dwarfs about dwarfism. Self-acceptance is part of the ideal, but without familial and societal acceptance, it cannot ameliorate the relentless injustices to which many horizontal identity groups are subject, and will not bring about adequate reform. We live in xenophobic times, when legislation with majority support abrogates the rights of women, LGBT people, illegal immigrants, and the poor. Despite this crisis in empathy, compassion thrives at home, and most of the parents I have profiled love across the divide. Understanding how they came to think well of their own children may give the rest of us motive and insight to do the same. To look deep into your child's eyes and see in him both yourself and something utterly strange, and then to develop a zealous attachment to every aspect of him, is to achieve parenthood's self-regarding yet unselfish abandon. It is astonishing how often such mutuality has been realized, how frequently parents who had supposed that they couldn't care for an exceptional child discover that they can. The parental predisposition to love prevails in the most harrowing of circumstances. There is more imagination in the world than one might think.
There is more imagination in the world than one might think. Where did that take you, your imagination?
So what was really striking to me was that almost all of the families I interviewed, the parents had a child who turned out to have some kind of condition that they thought of as undesirable and that they certainly were ignorant about and had no previous experience with. And when the families had the experience of having these children, a lot of them had despair about it. And then over time, they warmed to their own children, and they warmed in many ways to the conditions that their own children had. And that was a very rich and a very vital process. So I think, for example, of a family who had a child with Down syndrome, and they got very involved in changing the way people with Down syndrome are educated and devoted enormous energy to that enterprise. And when I said to them, well, you've really given your lives to this. I said, do you wish it weren't the case? Do you wish your son didn't have Down syndrome? Do you wish you'd never heard of Down syndrome? His mother said, you know, for my son, David, I wish he didn't have Down syndrome, because for David, it's a painful and difficult way to be in the world. But speaking for myself, while I would never have believed 23 years ago when he was born that I could come to such a point, speaking for myself, I wouldn't exchange these experiences for anything. For my son, I would cure it, but for me, it's made me a better, richer, more interesting person with a more complex life, doing more worthwhile things than I would ever have done otherwise. And for me, I cherish the experience I've had.
You mentioned Francis Fukuyama, who speaks of the post-human future, in which we eliminate the variety of mankind. Where amniocentesis is done, you find there's what is called a defect or a difference, and parents abort the child. So we're looking at a society that now has an option of creating perfect babies. And as you said, that it would kill the variety of mankind. That's frightening.
It's very frightening, and I think in some ways it's already happening. And what's happened in many of these situations is that at the exact same moment that the social acceptance for a condition has grown, the medical ability to eliminate that condition has also grown. So if you look, for example, at people who are deaf, there is more and more, at least in the United States and in much of Europe, an acceptance of deafness as a culture, at the same moment that the cochlear implant threatens to eliminate the condition functionally almost entirely. And if you look at people with Down syndrome, the level of achievement that they are able to arrive at is far greater than anyone dreamed was possible even 25 or 30 years ago, and yet we have this advance in amniocentesis. And what I ended up thinking is that in the same way that species diversity is crucial to sustain the planet, in the same way that we need to have different kinds of people, different kinds of species, that the difference within humanity is very valuable, and that we never know what will prove adaptive in some way, and that when we lose these conditions, we lose part of that human diversity, and that's a very real and very significant loss. So it's not that I think that the future problems of the world will be solved by dwarfs or by anyone else who's in a particular subgroup. It's that I think as we narrow the nature of what it is to be a human being, we're profoundly, profoundly giving up a lot of the richness of our own experience in life.
Would you read from Michael?
Michel Foucault,
Michel.
writing before the mapping of the genome was feasible, described how a technology of abnormal individuals appears precisely when a regular network of knowledge and power has been established. In other words, the spectrum of normality gets constrained when those in power consolidate their privilege. In Foucault's view, the idea of normality claimed to ensure the physical vigor and the moral cleanliness of the social body. It promised to eliminate defective individuals, degenerate and bastardized populations. In the name of biological and historical urgency, it justified the racisms of the state. It thus encouraged people outside normality to perceive themselves as helpless and inadequate. If, as Foucault has also argued, life is what is capable of error, and error itself is at the root of what makes human thought and its history, then to prohibit error would be to end evolution. Error lifted us out of the primordial slime.
How does one argue with people who believe that a perfect society, or what they deem as perfect, is what we should strive to? How do you answer a person who says, do you want to have a baby with disabilities, or do you want to have a child that is deaf?
Well, look, most people don't want to have a child with disabilities or even with deafness. If you ask people in the abstract ahead of time whether they want that experience, they will almost universally say no. But there are many people who, once they have that experience, find a great deal of meaning in it. And I don't think that we should insist that anyone have children they don't want. I don't think anyone should have children at all whom they don't want. But I do think that we should have people understand more richly what the experience is going to be of having children who are aberrant or who are different in some way. And a lot of the time, we have this crossing point between the social wish and the personal wish. So I think that there have been extraordinary accomplishments from disabled people in recent years, and that they've really changed a lot of the way we think and made for a kinder society. Would I want my own child to have a painful disability? Certainly not. I want my own child to be as happy and as well and as healthy as possible. Would I be sad if all of those achievements of disability were to vanish? Yes, I would be sad in that. And do I now, when I think about my own life as a gay person, did it involve certain difficulties? Yes, it did. And I know that if my parents had been given the option, they would, of course, have chosen for me to be straight. But has experiencing those challenges and difficulties made my own life a more worthwhile and a more profound life than I might otherwise have had? It's hard to know for sure, but I believe that. And ultimately, it's the belief rather than the knowledge that is the thing that contributes to that sense of meaning, that contributes to that sense of lives well lived, that contributes to that sense of a world made stronger and better by those within it who are weaker and different. Thank you. All kinds of attributes make one less able. Illiteracy and poverty are disabilities, and so are stupidity, obesity, and boringness. Extreme age and extreme youth are both disabilities. Faith is a disability insofar as it constrains you from self-interest. Atheism is a disability inasmuch as it shields you from hope. One might see power as a disability too, for the isolation in which it imprisons those who wield it. The disability scholar Stephen R. Smith posited, a completely painless existence could also be quite plausibly seen as deficient for most people. Likewise, any of these characteristics can embody strength, some more easily than others. We are all differently abled from one another, and context, which is socially constructed, often decides what will be protected and indulged. Being gay was a disability in the 19th century in a way that it isn't now, and it is now a disability in some locations in a way that it isn't in others. And it was a disability for me when I was young, and it isn't one for me today. The whole matter is intensely unstable. No one has ever suggested legal protections for ugly people to make up for the misaligned features that will compromise their personal and professional lives. For people disabled by inherent moral perplexity, we offer not support, but imprisonment. Thank you.
I think it's a very powerful paragraph. You turn prejudice completely on its head, exposing that prejudice could be about anything. And how did you initially come to this concept? That was it from your frustration with communicating when you were gay, when you wanted to come out, or was it parent-children relationships that you saw that had gotten twisted?
I started off on this whole project when I was assigned to write about the deaf for the New York Times. And when my editor assigned me the story, I thought it seemed like a very curious assignment. And I wasn't sure why he'd given it to me because I mostly did foreign reporting. And he said, this is a foreign culture within our own society. As I went along, I began to think that there were many of these foreign cultures within our own society. And I should say that I have a counterphobic tendency to rush toward things that frighten me. And so I think I took a lot of this on because I was frightened by these conditions. I was terribly uncomfortable with people with severe disabilities. I found criminals terrifying. I felt that people who were transgender were incomprehensible and they made my skin crawl. They made me so uncomfortable. And I wanted to go and see what is it like for the people who actually have those conditions, because I knew I had a condition that made some other people's skin crawl. And what I found as I went into those societies and I went deeper in and engaged with them more and more was that the very qualities that to me seemed punishing and terrible for them were imbued with all of this meaning. And so I found my point of view shifting. I found my discomfort disappearing, and I also found myself beginning not to feel sorry for these people, but in many instances to feel admiration for them. And I think it was with the dawn of that admiration that this book took its shape and came into being. I thought other people should know that this particular journey is possible and that actually it can be a very joyful journey for those who are willing to undertake it.
You quoted Rumi, a beautiful quote, "Light enters you from a bandaged place."
Yes, so the Rumi quote seemed to me rather to sum up this idea, which is that the people I know who have never faced difficulty of any kind, and as I get older there are fewer and fewer of them, are mostly leading what seem to me to be rather diminished lives. So I think that a lot of the meaning that people find in life comes from their experience of pain. I'm a father now, and I would like my children to experience as little pain as possible in most instances, and I will protect them from pain as much as I possibly can. But if someone said in the abstract, would you like them never to experience pain, I would have to say no. I'll protect them from each individual painful situation as it comes along to the best of my ability. But if they have a life without pain, they're much less likely to have a life with meaning. I myself feel, I mentioned earlier that my mother had died. After she died, I went through a depression. I wrote a book about that. I've now worked on this book. It's my consistent belief that if one is willing to grapple with difficulty bravely, it will make you a better person, and it will give you a deeper and more meaningful life. And to be completely without difficulty would be to have a diminished life.
Could you describe, Andrew, your trip to Bali? It's a fascinating chapter, which shows deaf people in a completely different light from what one is used to seeing.
So I went to Bali because there is a town in the north of Bali called Bengkala, in which there has been a form of hereditary deafness which has existed for at least 200 years and probably longer. The people in Bengkala have developed their own sign language, and because the gene is recessive, nobody ever knows who's going to have a deaf child. You might be hearing and have a deaf child, you might be deaf and have a hearing child, you might have a child who's like you or unlike you, but because of the pervasiveness of this condition, even though it affects only about 3% of the population, because it can crop up anywhere, everyone in Bengkala has learned sign language, and because they've all learned sign language, they're able to communicate, and all of the hearing people and all the deaf people can speak to one another. So nobody forgets who's deaf, but people think of it the way they think about being tall or short or having dark hair or having a big nose. It's a quality that someone has, but it's not really a disability because everyone in the village can communicate with everyone else. And though the village is poor and not idyllic in many ways, I thought that for deaf people it contained an element of an idyll because of the ability they now had to speak to one another.
Do you think sign language should be taught like a foreign language in school to everyone?
Sign language is now the 7th most popular language in American universities for people to study. What's ironic is that because of the cochlear implant, there are fewer people who need to rely on it, and there are more people who are interested in it from the linguistic standpoint. And I think that actually learning it can be fantastic. I mean, the grammar is so different, the conception of things is so different, the means of communication is so different, and it forces the parts of your brain that control movement and expression and the parts of your brain that control linguistic expression to come together. And I think in that coming together, there's really often quite a profound shift in the very functioning of your brain. So I think it's great for people to learn it. I don't think everyone has to, but I think anyone who's interested can learn a great deal from it, whether they're deaf or not.
Your chapter on autism. In India, a couple of years ago, a film was made called Tare Zameen Par, which I spoke to you about, which told the story of an autistic child, and it liberated a huge number of parents who didn't know what their children or child had, and they were informed of a syndrome which they were unaware of, and when it was identified, it helped them hugely. But I must admit, in our culture, differences, disabilities are still a form of ridicule, are still a form of derision, of ostracism. We're nowhere near what you're talking about in this book, sadly. I have to admit that. What do you think can be done more than just a film? In fact, I met a woman who had 2 grandchildren, and she was so open about it. She said, 2 of my kids, my grandchildren have this, and we're so blessed that we know what to do. But this is a woman who comes from a privileged background, and a large part of our population is not exposed to this, don't have the financial means to get the proper care. Do you have any sort of insights in this on how awareness of this can be spread?
So I think the first thing to say in response to where you began the question is that diagnosis is unbelievably valuable. If you know that your child has a syndrome that other children share, you can get a great deal of information about what is likely to happen, what the means of treatment are that might help to ameliorate or improve the condition. You have all of a sudden this world that opens up to you of knowledge. And so diagnosis is unbelievably precious. And also, and this was part of my purpose in writing about these conditions in this book, you feel less alone when you know that other people experience the same condition that you do. And the more you know about those other people, and the more you know about their experience, the less alone you will feel, and the better you will be able to be a parent to this child who is different and unusual in some way. Now, autism is a word that covers a broad spectrum of experience. There are people who are autistic who are essentially incredibly mathematical but without much social intelligence. Some of them are incredibly accomplished, and the world actually would be a weaker place if we didn't have individuals like that. There are theories that Mozart and Einstein and many other geniuses had some elements of autism. It's a term that also describes a child who sits with no language in the corner banging his head against the wall. The treatments that are effective for autism are many and various. None of them so far fully resolves the condition. I think really that what less advantaged people who have these children should know is what things can be changed, what things can't be changed, what things they should attempt to fix, and what things they should simply accept. But they also should know that the experience they have is one they share in common with untold hundreds of thousands, even millions of families if they look around the entire globe.
I was going to ask you to read a poem on schizophrenia, but I'm going to skip because I've been told that we're running out of time and there has to be time for questions. So I'll jump to the amazing story of this couple, Sarah and David, who lost their son Sam because the caretaker left him in the tub to get something, medicine, and he drowned. The most extraordinary part of the story is how the parents then showed compassion to this woman who was charged and prosecuted for their son being killed. Would you like to talk about that?
Yes, so David and Sarah Haddon had a son with severe disabilities. He couldn't walk, he couldn't talk, he couldn't communicate in any way. He appeared to be largely inert, but they were very devoted to him. They were told it was a random occurrence and that they shouldn't worry about it happening again, and then they had another child who had the same condition. And so they had these two grossly disabled children to take care of. And they took care of them at home until finally they became too big because they couldn't move. They had to be lifted in and out of bed, in and out of the bathtub. Their mother could no longer do it, and they were put into a group home where, as you've just said, one of them ultimately drowned in a bathtub. And I said to his mother, "What was your response to it?" And she said, "I saw the woman who'd done it." She said, and she was trembling with fear at seeing me again. And I just said to her, "Marvika, it could have been any of us. He required so much vigilance, and it's so difficult to keep that vigilance going the whole time." She said, and also, she explained to me, she said, taking care of children like this is not very well paid, it's very exhausting, it's difficult, painful work. And if I had brought a lawsuit against this woman who had taken care of our child, it would only have discouraged people from going into this field. And I didn't want to do that. So we arranged with the lawyers that she would never be allowed to work with disabled children again. We didn't just let it all go. But I thought there was nothing to be accused by being punishing. And then when she finally buried the ashes of that child at the funeral, she said something that was to me incredibly moving and relates to this question of what it is that one finds in these experiences. She said, "Let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed, once of the child I wanted and once of the son I loved." Thank you.
In your chapter on disability, you tell the story of Julia, who gives away her daughter because she has so many disabilities, and she discovers her own selfishness, and her husband discovers his selfishness, and they're not prepared to take care of a child who has so many needs, and they want to get a life of their own. Were you disappointed and angry when you spoke to them?
I wasn't disappointed and angry at all. I think that there are some people who are well suited to taking care of children in these difficult circumstances, and there are some people who are not. And some of the time, the people who are not well suited and who try to do it badly or end up incredibly frustrated. So I think people need to know themselves, and I think Julia and Jay appear to have had a great deal of self-knowledge and to have taken care of their child on the basis of that for a while, and to have decided then that they really weren't the ideal audience for, the ideal family for this child, and they gave her up for adoption, and she was adopted by someone who could take care of her much better. I thought they were quite courageous in admitting that. I met some families who had actually had these experiences and found profound meaning in them. I met some families who completely gave up their children in the way that Julia and Jay did. But I also met families where I thought, you really should have given your child up into care because you're not doing it very well, and it's creating a lot of despair and pain in you instead of giving you meaning, and you should know yourself well enough to let yourself go and think, all right, I'm not good at this, I'm going to go the other way.
Your chapter on transgenders, this is a subject that's rarely discussed in India. As we discussed backstage, we have the hijras, and that's a complex sort of society and culture where some are born that way, some are made that way, castrated, whatever. How do you respond to the fact that in our country there's an established separation of transgenders, whereas in Western countries they are absorbed?
Well, I think in Western countries sometimes they're absorbed and sometimes they aren't. I mean, I had the extraordinary experience of interviewing someone who had adopted 3 children, who had a mother who had been very abusive. They were all in terrible shape when she adopted them. She helped them to function and brought them out of the special education system for children with these disabilities and problems and brought them up to a higher level. And she was energetic in taking care of them, and eventually one of them was a boy who kept saying, "But I'm really a girl, but I'm really a girl, can't you see I'm a girl?" And she finally decided that she would let her child live as a girl for a period of time and see what it was like. And she said the change was beyond description. This child who had been depressed and withdrawn and miserable suddenly emerged and was joyful and full of life and exuberant about the things that lay ahead of him. She lived in a small town in the American South, and she went into the school where she had worked for 20 years and said, when my child comes back in the fall, she will come not as the boy that she was, but in this new identity as a girl. And she said by the time she got home, her phone had started ringing, and there were people saying they were going to castrate the child, they were going to kill the child, they were going to kill her, and the threats were so terrifying that she ultimately had to go into hiding and live under an assumed name in another city in America because she thought everything would be destroyed. And the day after she left, her husband, who had stayed behind because he needed the job to pay for their lives, went to work in the factory where he worked, and when he came home, he found the family dog disemboweled and nailed to a fence with a message saying, "Your child is next." So these acts of cruelty and separation are certainly not unknown in Western contexts. Having said that, I also met people who had made very successful transitions. I met families who were very supportive. I met people who were leading very good lives in the gender they had assumed. And some of them went into that gender and wanted to live entirely on the basis that if they had been born a male and were now living as a female, they were female, or vice versa. But some of them had an identity as transgender, and that identity has been asserted more and more and more. And so there was one woman I interviewed who had been, when she was younger, the quarterback on her high school football team as a boy, and was now a woman living in Manhattan. And she went back to her 20th high school reunion, at which my favorite moment was that she was there and talking to the other people at the reunion. One of them came over and said, "Nice to see you, Kim." And she said, "Well, nice to see you." And Kim was talking, and she said, "You know, Kim, we've all changed." But not always so profoundly as that. But in any event, Kim came back. She was invited to give the sermon at her church. She talked about the experience of transition, and she said, the great thing is that even the people who can't understand can accept. And being accepted is the thing that one most wants, she said. And it is the love that welcomes the unknowable, the foreign, and the strange home with open arms. That is the love that exalts us and that gives our lives meaning.
Andrew, I have a lot of questions which we haven't had time for, but we'll end with you reading the last paragraph of your book, and then we go to questions.
I'll just say before I read the last paragraph so that it's comprehensible, that when my son, who is here right now, was born, we were told immediately after he was born that he might have severe brain damage, and we then found out that he didn't. He was absolutely fine, but we'd gone through this terrifying moment of not being sure what was going to happen. So, and now I'll read that.
And also you had a choice of doing the usual amniocentesis and sonograms, which you refused to do.
Yes, we did the sonograms, but we
Okay.
didn't do amniocentesis. I think before I worked on this book, I would have done amniocentesis, and I wouldn't have wanted to have a child who had a disability of any kind. And after working on the book, I thought, I don't know quite what it would be like for me, but I felt as though it was something that I could imagine in a way that I previously hadn't been able to, that I could imagine, and that I could imagine as actually something that was rewarding. So I'll read to you. This is the end of the book. And I should emphasize also that I have my children with my husband, so within a gay family. That's also part of the story. Given how unimaginable my family would have been 50 years ago, I have no choice but to champion progress. Change has been good to me, and I am indebted to it. I hope these stories will contribute to the cataract that is honing the rough surface of the world. Until the planet grows smooth, however, love will continue to toughen under siege. The very threats to love strengthen it even as they suffuse it with pain. In the harsh moments of loss that are my topic here, love manacles a tender heart. I felt something brilliant and terrifying for my son as he lay in that Star Trek-like CAT scanner that I had not yet felt for little Blaine, who had not encountered such adversity, or for Oliver and Lucy, who were already themselves when I got to know them. It changed my relationship to them all. Children ensnared me the moment I connected fatherhood with loss, but I am not sure I would have noticed that if I hadn't been immersed in this research. Encountering so much strange love, I fell into its bewitching patterns and saw how splendor can illuminate even the most abject vulnerabilities. I had witnessed and learned the terrifying joy of unbearable responsibility, recognized how it conquers everything else. Sometimes I had thought the heroic parents in this book were fools, enslaving themselves to a life's journey with their alien children, trying to breed identity out of misery. I was startled to learn that my research had built me a plank, and that I was ready to join them on their ship. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome to ask questions.
Lady just here, first question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Observation, not a question, actually. I'm so glad I walked into this session. Instinct takes me, to sessions, and I'm just so indebted to you, Madhu, and all the audience here. I work with patients who've been diagnosed with cancer, and it's so true when you say the sense of isolation and how when they meet up in support groups, how it gives so much to families, to caregivers, and also my patients, despite the fear, the trauma of the diagnosis, knowing that they may die sooner or later, most often sooner, the aggressive treatment protocol they have to undergo, their changed body image, their changed role in society, they all come and say that they are filled with the joy, they are filled with inspiration, and they want to do the best in their lives. And today, with such a lot of improved and amazing therapy for cancer, we have survivors who go ahead with extension of life, better quality of life, and they're filled with this enthusiasm. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I think we have a question over on the left-hand side.
Morning, sir. First of all, I would like to thank you because it has indeed been a very enlightening session for us.
Thank you.
So I wanted to know that when you went to Bali, you saw that everyone in the village there learned the sign language to communicate with the deaf people, because there was a whole deaf community there. But then if you see like a small village in India, where there's not a whole deaf community, but just one deaf person, or maybe two deaf people. But so how can don't you think it is very less likely that the whole village is going to learn a sign language? Or you're talking about identity and illness. So don't you think it's very less likely that people will see it more like an illness and less of an identity? Because there are very few of those who are deaf.
Absolutely, and the village in Bali, I traveled there because it was so extraordinary and exceptional. It's certainly not the usual way for the whole village to learn sign language. One of the real messages of this book is that community is absolutely central to the emergence of identity. So if you have a city in which there are hundreds of deaf people, even if everyone doesn't know sign language, they can form a community and develop a sense of identity. If you have a village where there's one deaf person, it will be experienced and lived as an illness, experienced both by the person who is affected and by his family and by the whole rest of the village. For any of these identities to emerge, there needs to be community. Now, a lot of these conditions have developed community because people are able to communicate on the internet and so on, but that's obviously for a literate population that has access to a computer. For someone who's born in the isolation you've described, no, it's not an identity, it's an illness, and it probably always will be.
We have a question just here.
Hello, good morning. First of all, I just wanted to thank you. It's a very touching session for me. I really enjoyed it. And also the question which I want to ask is, like in India, like in buildings, on roads, we don't have structures to help the disabled people. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say, like handicapped people. We do not have ways or any transport medium for them. So do you think it should be incorporated in India, for example, in a lift or in anything else? And second question is, I love the title of your book, Far from the Tree, but if you could just explain more about it, why did you choose that title? Thank you.
Yeah. So two questions really, and the first is about the need for handicapped access in India. I'm hesitant to say what India should or shouldn't do coming from another country, but I do think that when the physical access is provided so that people can use libraries, so that they can get to train stations, so that they can travel and move, that's wonderfully liberating for people. And I think if it were possible to achieve that in India, it would be tremendous. I think the movement toward providing access in the United States has really made the society and culture richer by allowing people to mix on equal terms where they previously couldn't. And the title of the book is Far from the Tree. There's an adage, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, which is used to mean that most people are very much like their parents. You can see all of the similarities. And I, in looking at these various identities, was looking specifically at identities people have that differ from those of their parents. So any identity that's passed down generation to generation is reinforced. Your ethnicity, your religion, your nationality, your language, those are generally passed from parent to child. And because they pass down in that fluid way, they're generally reinforced. You grow up with parents who are the same as you, and they tell you to be proud of who you are. The things I've looked at are the illnesses or identities which the parents have no previous experience with, and the parents, instead of giving their children pride in those illnesses and identities, tend rather to try to cure them or fix them. And I wanted to look at that and say, okay, what do we do when the apple does fall far from the tree? How do parents manage actually to give their child a sense of self-worth, even in the face of the strangeness and difference there may be between them?
There have been, in Delhi at least, very strong lobbies from people who wanted special facilities made in subway, in this train stations, in the metro, in buses, and they have been successful in getting it done, but not enough.
We only have a few minutes left, I'm afraid, so a couple more questions. But is there any of the school kids that would like to ask a question? We've got a lot of people out here, but is there anyone of the youngsters? No? Okay. This lady, and then we have one here. Oh, yeah, no, you're right. No,
This lady in the red, yeah.
Maybe I could ask on behalf of the students. I'm their teacher. What I was thinking as I was going through the session, that as we were just discussing, in India, we still don't have enough awareness, and many a time parents fail to find out this trait of differences in the children. They remain unidentified, and when they come to the school, many a times we teachers even fail to understand those differences, and maybe sometimes we treat the child a little too strict. As you were saying, there are various levels of autism also. What role does mainstream education system play in bringing out an inclusiveness of these children in the society?
So first of all, I would like to say how delighted I am to have all of the youngsters here, to have a school class, and to thank you all for coming, and your teacher. There's been a lot of question about what the school does in relation to what the family does. And I think often if you have a family that has trouble accepting their child's difference, the school can be a place where the child finds acceptance. And often if the parents see that there's acceptance at the school, that helps them to be accepting at home. Contrariwise, it can be the case that the family accepts the child, and when the people at school are not able to accept the child, the family can come in and explain and effectively translate for what is to happen to make the child accepted at school. I think schools play a very important role. There's been a big movement in the United States toward mainstreaming, which is a means of saying that people with differences should be educated in a classroom with other people without them. It seems to me we need a balance in which they spend some time in a special classroom where things are beamed at their level, and they spend other time mixing with other children. And I think the mixing with other children is valuable for the person with disability because it prepares him to live in the real world, but it is also valuable for those other children who grow up not finding that their skin crawls when they see someone who's different or disabled, but actually engaging with the real and specific person and thinking when they next see someone who has a difference, that's just another difference. And I think one of the big messages of the book is that each individual difference feels very isolating. If you're talking only about schizophrenia, there aren't so many families dealing with a child with schizophrenia. But if you're dealing with the idea that difference altogether, having a child who is somewhat foreign to you, is part of the experience of parenting, then you're dealing with probably more than half the parents in the world. So it's to find that sense of commonality and community, and the school is very helpful in building that sense, saying, okay, this child has learning disabilities, this child might have autism, this child doesn't hear very well, all of us are in this together. That, I think, is the message for the school.
And I think we have to plead guilty that especially in our private schools, even getting a child in according to their admission norms. Our norms are basically that a child, when she's interviewed for admission in school, in kindergarten, they have to be outgoing, sporty, talkative, friendly, basically cookie-cutter assembly line. And if any child is different from that, which is shy, soft-spoken, retiring, not sporty, it's tough for that kid to get admission. That's how extreme our demand is to have what is called normal children.
That's
a terrible word.
The same thing exists in many of those schools in the United States. But sometimes, actually, it's being privileged that cuts you off from these experiences. Because, as the person who asked a question earlier said, if you're in the village and there's a deaf person, you're all in the village, you may treat it as an illness, but there's no way you can escape from that person. You're in the village together. If you're at this privileged level, you can cut yourself off from these experiences. And I think doing so is a very dangerous path to tread.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. I do apologize. We were going to try and sneak in a couple more questions, but it's been an amazing session. Madhu, would you like to finish up?
Thank you, Andrew. I think I don't think I've learned as quickly from one book so much as I have in yours. It's been exhilarating and consoling in a personal way, and okay, bye-bye, and inspiring in every way. Thank you very much for giving so much of yourself in this session.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you.
And as an additional thank you from the Jaipur Literature Festival, a scarf for both Andrew and Madhu. Thank you so much. And thank you very much to you for your patience. I'm so sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions. Andrew will be going over to the book signing table, so please take your questions, go and purchase the book if you were inspired by this session. It's over on the left of the information desk. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Please, please, if you have any rubbish and you're leaving your seat, please pop it in the bin. I'd really appreciate that. And we will be back for our next session in about 10 minutes. Thank you so much.